The moment didn't look extraordinary at first. It was just another stop on a demanding tour schedule in El Paso, another night filled with roaring crowds, flashing lights, and the kind of energy that only global superstars like Jimin and Jungkook could command so effortlessly. The stage had already cooled down, the echoes of cheers fading into the Texas night, and the backstage area buzzed with the usual post-show chaos, staff moving quickly, members exchanging tired smiles, water bottles being passed around. But something felt different. There was a quiet shift in the air that no one could quite explain at first, a subtle tension, a pause in the rhythm. Jungkook noticed it before anyone else did. He had been laughing just seconds earlier, still riding the adrenaline of the performance, his hair slightly damp, his chest rising and falling as he tried to catch his breath. But then his eyes drifted, almost instinctively, toward the entrance of the backstage corridor. And that's when he froze. At first, it didn't register. The figure standing there wasn't someone he expected to see in a place like this, not in the middle of a tightly scheduled tour stop thousands of miles away from home. For a split second, Jungkook's expression flickered between confusion and disbelief, like his mind was trying to catch up with what his eyes were already seeing. Then it hit him. His entire posture changed. His laughter disappeared from his face, replaced by something much deeper, something raw and unfiltered. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His eyes widened, glistening under the soft backstage lighting as recognition settled in. It was Jimin's mother. She wasn't surrounded by cameras. There was no announcement, no grand introduction, just her presence, quiet, warm, and unexpectedly powerful. And in that single moment, everything shifted. Jungkook took a step forward, then another. It was slow at first, almost hesitant, like he was afraid if he moved too quickly, the moment might disappear. But as reality settled in, his pace quickened, his emotions catching up with him all at once. "Oh, Moni," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a softness in the way he said it, respectful, gentle, but filled with something that felt far more personal than a simple greeting. Jimin, who was just a few steps away, turned at the sound. And then he saw her too. Time seemed to stop. For a brief second, Jimin didn't move at all. His body went completely still, his eyes locking onto the familiar figure in front of him. The exhaustion from the performance, the noise, the chaos, it all faded into the background. What remained was something deeply human, something vulnerable. "Mom!" Jimin's voice cracked as he spoke, the words slipping out before he could even process it. There was no hesitation after that. He moved quickly, almost instinctively, closing the distance between them in a matter of seconds. And when he reached her, he didn't hold back. He wrapped his arms around her tightly, like he had been holding that moment in for too long. The embrace was firm, real, unfiltered. And Jungkook stood there, just a step away, watching it unfold. There was something in his expression, something that fans would later analyze frame by frame, slowing down clips, zooming into details, trying to capture the exact emotion behind his eyes. Because it wasn't just happiness, it wasn't just surprise, it was something deeper, something that felt personal. Jimin pulled back slightly, his hands still resting on his mother's shoulders, his eyes already glossy. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice trembling between laughter and tears. "I wanted to see you," she replied softly, her gaze filled with warmth. Simple words, but the impact was anything but simple. Jungkook finally stepped closer. There was a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, where he seemed unsure of what to do. Should he bow? Should he speak? Should he give them space? But Jimin noticed. Of course he did. He turned slightly, his hand instinctively reaching out, not to pull Jungkook in forcefully, but to gently guide him closer. It was a small gesture, almost subconscious, but it didn't go unnoticed. Not by the staff, not by the cameras that would later capture fragments of this moment, and definitely not by the fans. "Mom," Jimin said softly, his voice still emotional. "You remember Jungkook, right?" There was a subtle emphasis in the way he said it. Not, "This is Jungkook," but "you remember." As if this wasn't their first meeting, as if there was already a familiarity there. Jungkook bowed respectfully, but before he could straighten up completely, Jimin's mother reached out and held his hands. It was unexpected, gentle, and deeply intimate in a way that went beyond formal politeness. "I've heard so much about you," she said, her gaze kind, her grip warm. Jungkook's composure cracked, just slightly, but enough.
No, he started, but his words faltered. His usual confidence, the charisma that lit up stadiums, seemed to fade in that moment. What remained was something much more sincere, much more vulnerable. "Thank you for taking care of Jimin," she continued. And that's when it happened. Jungkook's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. He blinked quickly, trying to hold it in, his lips pressing together as he nodded. "I always will," he said quietly. The words lingered in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke, because something about that exchange felt different. It didn't feel like a casual conversation. It didn't feel like something meant for the public. It felt private, personal, like a moment that wasn't supposed to be witnessed by anyone else. Jimin noticed it too. His gaze shifted between Jungkook and his mother, his expression softening even more. There was a quiet emotion in his eyes, something that fans would later describe as a mix of gratitude, love, and something they couldn't quite put into words. And then, he reached for Jungkook's hand. It wasn't a grand gesture, it wasn't even intentional, perhaps, but it happened. His fingers brushed against Jungkook's wrist, then lingered just a second longer than necessary, and Jungkook didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned into it, just slightly, just enough to be felt. The kind of moment that would be replayed endlessly, analyzed, discussed, because it wasn't about what was obvious, it was about what was felt. And in that small, quiet corner of a backstage area in El Paso, something unfolded that went far beyond a simple reunion. It felt like something else entirely, something deeper, something that left everyone, staff, members, and eventually millions of fans, wondering the same thing. What did that moment really mean? And why did it feel like so much more than just a reunion? The question didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder with every passing minute after that unexpected meeting backstage in El Paso, because moments like that don't just disappear. They linger. They settle into the atmosphere, into the expressions people carry afterward, into the small, almost invisible gestures that follow. And for those who were there, something had undeniably shifted. The staff tried to move things along, gently reminding everyone of the schedule, the next transitions, the logistics that never stop in the middle of a world tour. But even as people resumed their roles, there was a quiet awareness in the room. Conversations softened, movements slowed. Jimin stayed close to his mother, still processing the surprise, still holding on to her presence like he didn't want the moment to end. Every now and then, he would glance at her again, almost as if to reassure himself that she was really there. And Jungkook? He didn't leave. He could have. There were a dozen reasons for him to step away, to change, to rest, to prepare for whatever came next. But instead, he lingered nearby, just within reach, like he felt drawn to the moment in a way he couldn't explain. There was a subtle protectiveness in the way he positioned himself, not intrusive, not overwhelming, but present. Always present. At one point, Jimin's mother laughed softly at something Jimin said, and Jungkook's eyes immediately shifted toward them, his lips curving into a small, almost shy smile. It wasn't the smile he gave on stage. It wasn't practiced or performed. It was real. And that detail alone would later become one of the most talked about parts of the entire encounter. Because fans noticed everything. They noticed how Jungkook listened more than he spoke, how he nodded attentively when Jimin's mother talked, how he seemed careful, almost intentional with every word he chose, every movement he made.
And then came the moment that would send the fandom into complete emotional chaos. It happened quietly, almost too quietly. Jimin had stepped away for a brief second, called over by a staff member who needed to confirm something urgent. It wasn't far, just a few steps, but it created a small space. A small pocket of time where Jungkook and Jimin's mother were left alone. And for a second, neither of them spoke. Jungkook looked down briefly, as if gathering his thoughts, his hands clasped lightly in front of him. There was a visible shift in his breathing, slower now, more controlled, but still carrying the weight of everything he had just felt. Then she spoke. "You've grown a lot," she said gently. It wasn't a loud statement, but it landed deeply. Jungkook looked up, surprised, his eyes meeting hers. He hesitated, a soft, almost nervous laugh escaping him. "I'm still learning." There was humility in his voice, but also honesty. She smiled.
Not just politely, but knowingly. "I can see how much you care about him," she continued. And just like that, the air changed again. Jungkook didn't answer immediately. He couldn't, because what do you say to something like that? His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded, once, slowly. And that single gesture carried more meaning than any sentence could. Because it wasn't denial, it wasn't deflection, it was acknowledgement, pure and simple. From a distance, Jimin turned back. He didn't hear the words, but he saw the moment. He saw the way Jungkook was standing, still, attentive, emotional in a way that only someone who truly knew him would recognize. And he saw his mother's expression, soft, warm, filled with a kind of quiet understanding. And something in Jimin's face changed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't obvious, but it was there. A softness, a stillness, a kind of emotional clarity that fans would later describe as the moment everything made sense. When Jimin returned to their side, the energy shifted again, but this time it felt lighter, warmer, like something unspoken had already been understood. They stood close, closer than before, almost instinctively forming a small, quiet circle that felt separate from everything else happening around them. Jimin spoke softly, explaining bits of the show, pointing out small details, laughing here and there. And Jungkook stayed right there beside him. Not behind, not ahead, beside. At one point, Jimin reached out again, this time more naturally, more freely, and lightly tugged at Jungkook's sleeve as he said something. It was such a simple gesture, the kind that might go unnoticed in any other context. But here, it meant everything. Because Jungkook responded immediately, turning his attention fully to Jimin, his expression softening in a way that felt instinctive, familiar, like second nature. And Jimin's mother saw it. She didn't interrupt, she didn't comment, but her eyes followed the interaction quietly, thoughtfully, as if she was observing not just what they were saying, but what they weren't. Time passed faster than any of them wanted. It always does in moments like this. Eventually, the staff approached again, this time more gently, more apologetically. There were schedules to keep, transitions to make, responsibilities that couldn't be delayed any longer. The moment had to end. Or at least pause. Jimin's expression shifted again, just slightly, as reality set in. "You have to go already?" he asked softly, his voice carrying that familiar mix of disappointment and understanding. His mother reached up, brushing his hair back gently, an instinctive, affectionate gesture that made him smile as his eyes grew glossy again. "I'll see you soon," she said. Then she turned to Jungkook. There was no rush in her movement, no hesitation. She stepped closer, and for a brief second, it looked like she might simply say goodbye. But instead, she pulled him into a hug. It was unexpected and deeply emotional. Jungkook froze at first, clearly caught off guard, but it only lasted a heartbeat.
Then, slowly, carefully, he returned the embrace, his arms wrapping around her with a quiet respect that spoke volumes. His eyes closed, just for a second, and when he opened them again, they were shining. "Thank you," he said softly. 2 simple words, but his voice carried something heavier, something that lingered. When she pulled away, she placed a gentle hand on his arm, just for a moment, and smiled. It wasn't a formal goodbye. It felt personal, meaningful, final in a way that made everything before it feel even more significant. Jimin stepped in again, hugging her tightly one last time before she left. His expression caught somewhere between happiness and something much more fragile. And Jungkook stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. Neither of them moved away, not immediately. They watched as she disappeared down the corridor, the space she left behind somehow feeling fuller than before. Because something had been given in that moment, something unspoken, something that didn't need to be explained. Jimin exhaled slowly, his head tilting slightly, as if he was still processing everything. And then, without thinking, he leaned just slightly toward Jungkook, not enough to be obvious, but enough to be felt. And Jungkook didn't move. If anything, he adjusted subtly, closing that small distance even more. No words, no performance, just presence. And that was the moment fans would never stop talking about. Not the surprise, not even the tears, but that quiet in-between space where nothing was said, and yet everything seemed understood. Because in a world where so much is staged, scripted, and carefully controlled, that moment didn't feel like any of those things. It felt real. And maybe that's why it stayed, not just in clips or screenshots, but in the hearts of those who saw it, who felt it, who recognized something deeper in the way Jungkook looked at Jimin, and the way Jimin never once let him drift too far away. In the end, no one could confirm what it all meant. There were no official statements, no clear explanations, just fragments of a moment that felt too intimate to fully belong to the public. And maybe that's exactly why it mattered so much. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones that are told outright. They're the ones that are felt, quietly, deeply, and all at once. And in El Paso, on a night that was supposed to be just another stop on a tour, something happened. Something soft, something fleeting, something that for a brief moment felt a lot like home. If this moment made you feel something too, if you saw what so many others are still trying to understand, then maybe that's the beauty of it. Some connections don't need confirmation. Some emotions don't need words. And some stories stay with you long after the moment ends.